Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the anniversary of October 7th, Trump's battle with Chicago and Portland over the deployment of National Guard troops, and the sudden and surprising popularity of the philosopher Nick Land. I'm joined by Geoff Shullenberger and Ashley Frawley, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So it's been, 2 years since the October 7th attack on Israel. A lot has happened since. In the days preceding today, I thought, as we record on October 7th, I thought back to the protests I went to on October 8th in New York City. This was one of the first pro-Palestine protests. And it was very striking for a lot of reasons. But I think the thing that most stuck with me was one of the chants, which was "From Palestine to Mexico, all the walls have got to go." And that gave me an inkling, which has become a conviction since, that these protests weren't just about what is occurring in the Levant, but are also directed against conditions in the United States. So I wrote about that this week for Compact in a piece called "How Black Lives Matter was replaced by Free Palestine." And in there I discussed the work of Ta-Nehisi Coates and of Nicole Hannah-Jones more glancingly. But I think if you read the work of activists who are involved in the Free Palestine movement, they will affirm that they're part of a kind of global decolonial struggle, and that it does extend far beyond the West. So I think it's maybe worth keeping that in mind when we ask why these protests have taken on such urgency in so many Western cities. I don't think the people who are involved in them are just engaging in kind of moral tourism and speaking about events in a far-off land they've never seen. I think they're also speaking about their own experiences and their own aspirations.
Matthew, your piece brought me back to something I wrote in late 2023, which I had begun writing prior to October 7th, which was a review of various books in the anti-woke genre that was proliferating at the time. Several years, with the publishing industry's cycles being what they are, sort of 2 to 3 years after the peak woke moment of 2020, there were a slew of titles kind of responding to that coming out. And so I wrote a review of a number of them. And in the middle of reading those books and eventually writing about them, October 7th happened. And it did seem to me a kind of, it clearly marked a kind of sea change in the culture war, both on the progressive side and on the conservative side. And so that struck me at the time. I also discussed the role of Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is a figure you discussed in your piece this week, who was kind of the leading intellectual of the Black Lives Matter moment, at least in its early phase. Interestingly, by 2020, he had somewhat, receded from the spotlight, seemed to not have entirely enjoyed his earlier celebrity, and had decided to write some fiction and things like that. So he, interestingly, had kind of, by the time 2020 came around, he wasn't necessarily at the center of the conversation. But it was interesting to see, as I noted at the end of 2023, that he had already kind of signed on to some of these Palestine solidarity letters, and then eventually would come out with a book, The Message, which sort of attempted to recalibrate his ideas to connect them to this new cultural moment in which the Black struggle, deeply tied to American history, was no longer the kind of salient story and instead you had this kind of turn to an international context. So, one thing about your piece I think is important is that it's not really about what you think of whether Israel is justified in its actions or whether you disagree with that. It's about what it means in the American context that this has become kind of the leading issue for progressive activists. And I think, one way that you've seen people on the left who are, not necessarily unsympathetic to the Palestine movement, and in some cases are quite sympathetic to it, respond to its salience is to say, look, I mean, this is important, but ultimately this is not going to be a kind of majority issue because the majority of people just aren't concerned about something happening on the other side of the world. And so I think that is kind of a critique you've heard from within the left of this. What you argue, which I think is important, is that it says something about the shifting demographic composition of America and of the younger American population. That basically the fundamental drama of the sort of centuries-long freedom struggle of Black America is no longer the sort of main narrative of social justice, and instead has become a kind of piece of this global narrative of social justice in which everything is understood as a kind of anti-colonial or decolonial project. And this is something that people who are first generation Americans can kind of connect their own experiences to. And it's not that the Black experience is entirely, the Black American experience is entirely excluded. It's that it's integrated and incorporated into this broader narrative. And so that, and as you point out, something that's kind of interesting is this flared up somewhat in the debates over Biden's run for re-election, as well as the sort of left critiques of the Harris campaign from the Palestine solidarity side, which is that you had Black leaders, who had generally been extremely pro-Biden, and had kind of clinched his primary victory
in South Carolina.
Yes, in South Carolina in 2020. Yeah. And so there was a sense in which Biden was, really, he owed his presidency to the presence of the kind of old, Black constituency within the Democratic Party. And so you have people saying, well, turning against Biden or saying you're going to vote third party or, refuse to vote is a kind of betrayal of Black Democrats who, for whom, Biden is kind of their guy, and then for whom, sort of Harris can play the same role. And so you saw this kind of play out in that context. But, something I find kind of interesting about this, though, is that, the decolonization narrative is itself, I argued in my piece about the poverty of anti-wokeness that, you should really understand wokeness as neo-wokeness, because in many ways you can trace its themes back to certain radical strains of Black activism from, starting in the 1950s through the 1970s that sort of petered out with the collapse of the Black Panthers in the early 70s. But this kind of, these sort of anti-assimilationist kind of hard, Black nationalist strains of the civil rights movement, or that kind of fractured off of the civil rights movement, that these ideas are revived in the 2010s. And so this, I think, is an interesting case where on one hand it represents this kind of new development within America, which is the huge proportion of first generation immigrants from Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and the Middle East, who don't have a kind of familial connection to the founding conflicts and struggles of the country. but at the same time, what's interesting is that the narrative that they're picking up on, this kind of decolonization narrative. I mean, I wrote something about Frantz Fanon, also in the wake of October 7th, about what I called therapeutic decolonization. And so what's interesting is that, to kind of capture and provide a kind of discourse for this new progressive coalition, which has this much more kind of global background, there's this revival of a strain of discourse that is in some ways quite I mean, it's extremely anachronistic. um, that indeed, if you like me were in graduate school in the 2000s into early 2010s, there's a huge amount of kind of post-colonial and sort of decolonial scholarship, the starting point of which is that these voices like Fanon don't really that they're important, but they don't really capture the reality of like the global South over the past several decades post-independence. And so you have all these attempts to recalibrate those discourses, but what I see is mostly this kind of reclaiming of this original third worldist rhetoric, which is in some ways just really kind of out of keeping with what's actually going on in the world today, which is a kind of weakening role of the West as a sort of a weakening ability of the West to exercise some kind of global hegemony. And so this, I think, is sort of interesting that this October 7th prompts the rediscovery. I mean, another interesting one was the recent death of Asada Shakur, the black, one of these kind of radical black nationalists who ended up in exile in Cuba after being broken out of prison after she had been convicted of killing a New Jersey state trooper. And she was celebrated by these young sort of millennial and Gen Z left organizations like the DSA. And in some ways, her entire paradigm is, I would argue, sort of profoundly irrelevant to much of the situation of the world today. And she was really a kind of living relic. But at the same time, that there is something noteworthy about the fact that this the impact of October 7th, like the sort of first years of the Black Lives Matter movement, where you saw this kind of revival and rediscovery of certain strains of rhetoric that you can trace back to the mid 20th century. Similarly, here you have this prompting of a kind of revival of these discourses that are, in many ways, I think, quite that obviously they capture something, but I think something that's kind of interesting is like if you imagine, I grew up around many of my closest friends growing up were children of immigrants from Asia, Africa, and I just think like if you presented their parents with rhetoric from sort of the anti-colonial struggle, they would see it as, I think, for the most part, just kind of absurdly anachronistic, right? Because most of them sort of experienced, living under post-colonial regimes, and basically wanted to migrate to the West for opportunities. And so that so they didn't see the original anti-colonial struggles as some kind of great triumph. On the contrary, so I think there's something kind of interesting about this kind of revival of this strain of discourse that is in some ways just a very poor. It's kind of it provides a narrative that is useful for certain people who are trying to connect themselves politically to this moment, but at the same time, it's weirdly anachronistic and kind of out of keeping with the state of the world today.
Well, one thing that I think is very interesting about the response to October 7th, and I thought your piece Matthew was extremely perceptive about how, it's so interesting how overnight this like baton gets passed from one big issue to the next, and it becomes the symbolic thing that you're supposed to. I mean, people have made this point 1,000 times where it's just like empty flag waving, like, oh, you put a flag on your profile, but it's just sort of like everybody's like like COVID is all there is, and then it's like, nope, Ukraine, and then it's like, nope, Palestine. And you have to show your colors, but I feel like in each one of these iterations, the thing that I keep seeing is like this. These are supposed to be sort of leftist things, and they will have these kind of symbolic nods to leftist imagery to make it seem as though this is like the bread and butter of like some legacy of socialism. So, we've got obviously with Palestine, it's decolonization. It's well, and the obvious kind of the horror at an extremely powerful nation, at an asymmetric warfare and so on, and killing of civilians, obviously. But that also fits in with what the left had become in terms of looking for a victim that they can hold up, that you have this kind of leftist victimology that became very central to everything that did. But the other thing too is this kind of symbolic nod to internationalism. Oh, we are socialists. Are we not international? And then this becomes, well, that's the uniting thing. Obviously, that's why we care so much. But I think all of these things were kind of symbolic nods for what was essentially what the left has become, which is essentially a negative abolition that with COVID, with Black Lives Matter, with Palestine, it's like, just stop, it's like COVID is like sticking it to the man by stopping. Wasn't that what they were saying for all this time? If you could just like stop, if we all just stopped giving in to capitalism, wouldn't it just all kind of fall down overnight? And this COVID was like the opportunity to kind of put the brakes on. That's what it seemed like. With Palestine, obviously, it's like sort of you have your redemption in real time. It's too late for America. You are in a post-colonial state. It's everything has progressed. You have to sort of give your express your guilt, but you're not going anywhere. We all know that the land's not going back to anybody. In fact, somebody called land back threatened to kill me recently. So like I don't know, like all of this is just completely and totally symbolic. But over there, now it appears to be real. We have this ability to stop a colonizing force in real time, or so it appears. But it isn't. As I was kind of starting to say, all of this is a kind of an attempt. So you can have a negative abolition and a positive abolition. So I'm kind of drawing on Karl Marx, Capital Volume 3, where he talks about like the stock market is a kind of negative abolition of capitalism, and co-ops are a kind of positive, whereas they both kind of take part in the gradual breaking down of capitalism and its becoming, but only one sees a future and tries to build it. And we are seeing people take part in trying to stop things, trying to abolish capitalism, but in a negative way, because it sees no purpose in building something up. We've been through the 20th century. You can't have a positive abolition of capitalism because you get the USSR and you get, everything deteriorates and you get a loss of freedom and it's all horrible and maybe we deserve it. And so you have this profound kind of negativity in terms of just tearing down everything. There's no future. There's nothing left. And I know people will be very mad at me for reading Palestine in this way, but I do think that's part of the reason why it gives all of these wonderful kind of tick boxes. Look, I get this. I get to sort of play out my supposed socialism, but that all operates at the symbolic level. The real driving force behind it, I think, is the negative. The fact that we're trapped in the negative, trapped in the abolition. And you want proof of this? Just take the obvious point that everybody makes, and it's not whataboutery. It's why is there a singular concern for this particular conflict when there's a complete lack of concern for all sorts of conflicts in which lots of civilians are killed? And I'm not saying like, what about this? I'm just saying this particular conflict is so symbolic for this ability to kind of put an end to something when you can't see the progressive force. You're no longer able to see any rational kernel in something like colonialism, in something like the West, in the Enlightenment, in capitalism. All you see is the negative, and you see no future. You start to search around for, well, there must be some authentic subject into which I can realize myself vicariously, because it's not possible for me. So I will realize my authenticity through this decolonial subject, the Palestinian, who will be authentic in a way that I can't be authentic. Obviously, we have a search for authenticity that's a core part of modernity in Western society, where you have all of this unprecedented freedom but no meaning, and so people have been, that's the politics has been displaced by the quest for authenticity. But that quest for authenticity is constantly packaged and becomes a lifestyle and becomes vocabularies and so on, and everybody knows that. But if you could sort of find a subject outside of that, you can find an authentic subject that can't be captured, that can't be made into like a consumer lifestyle. And so this is the ideal subject because it's on the fringe, on the border of the West, just outside of it, fighting against what is symbolic of capitalism, symbolic for them, symbolic of the West, symbolic of capitalism, symbolic of colonialism, which is Israel. So I think this is part of the reason why this has become so powerful. It was always possible, always latent. But I think obviously with October 7th, it was like it sort of burst forward, which is why almost immediately people were protesting Israel before even Israel had disproportionately responded. It was because that subject was the ideal authentic subject, and this has been the sort of displacement activity for all of politics, is to destroy and to look for something authentic and connected to something outside of the West, that's sort of real and through which we can realize ourselves.
Trump is engaged in an invasion of Chicago, Illinois, according to the city's mayor. Watching the debates over Trump's kind of threats to deploy National Guard troops to Chicago and Portland, I was reminded of the nullification crisis faced by Andrew Jackson when South Carolina threatened to rebel because of its reluctance to pay duties that had been brought in and that disadvantaged it and other southern states. But I guess there are a few dissimilarities between that historical moment and our own. Geoff, what have you made of this latest mini crisis?
One way I'm thinking about the current moment or the past several years is that one way to read the what I would think of as the mimetic escalation between the two partisan factions in this country is that each is trying to conjure up or generate the enemy that they want to be fighting. And to some extent they've on a few occasions proven successful at this. So part of how I'm reading there's sort of a policy level way we could talk about what's going on in these cities. I think there are legitimate things to object to about how certain cities have been run in terms of both their handling of immigration and their basically enabling, and Portland in 2020 would be an egregious case of this, that they're just kind of enabling these extremely destructive and violent protesters to run amok. If you recall, in 2020, you had these protesters basically just like bombarding a federal building constantly, day in and day out for months, basically engaged in this kind of full-on violent revolt against the federal government. And this was kind of tolerated. You had these kind of marauding bands Portland is just kind of a bizarre situation. You had these like marauding bands of protesters like going around wandering around residential neighborhoods shouting at people to wake up. One of the more bizarre moments in 2020, where it was like they were protesting other people not protesting or something like that. So the point is, I think there's plenty to criticize in terms of how these cities have been governed. And, there's also a legitimate debate to be had about these kind of sanctuary city policies and the sort of noncompliance with federal immigration enforcement. And, these are all sort of worthwhile policy debates. So to that extent, I can sort of see the Steelman version of what the administration is attempting to do, which is to say these cities are behaving lawlessly, and therefore, we need to kind of send in the cavalry to force some sort of restoration of order. So, that I suppose, again, would be the stronger case for this sort of thing. But it does seem to me there's another thing going on here, which you can find parallels for in various things that the Biden administration did and that sort of Democrats have done in the past, which is that I think there is an attempt to kind of conjure up, again, the enemy that they want to be fighting. So it was clear after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, many statements from different figures in the administration, Stephen Miller heavily on this beat for the past, really since Trump came into office, the claim repeatedly is that there's this sort of armed, organized insurgency of the left and of Democrats, and it's a terrorist movement, against the legitimate powers of government. And so it seems to me a large part of what's going on here is that there's an attempt to use these kind of gestures to force these, alleged terrorists and sort of armed, organized insurgents to come out of the woodwork so that there can be this kind of public confrontation with them. And, if they provide some sort of pretext for a crackdown of the sort that Miller has been advocating, then that seems to be what they're hoping will happen. So it does seem to me that you can read this as, again, a sort of attempt to conjure up the enemy that they want to be fighting, and that seems to me, if the goal here is to restore order to major cities, to have an orderly enforcement of immigration and other policies, then that is not going to be a good way to achieve that. I think what it's more likely to do is generate. So far I can't really tell. I mean, these I haven't been following it closely. There obviously are protesters in Portland, but I've seen pictures of a guy dressed in a frog costume, protesting the ICE agents. So it doesn't seem that these are particularly formidable or terrifying protesters. And, indeed the most widely, most widely seen and commented on depictions of the Portland, left-wing insurgency are these Andy No collections of mugshots where there are all these kind of, sort of debased, degenerate looking, kind of sickly people. So I'm not sure if they, I'm not sure if they if you compare that to, say, what we saw in the film Eddington, which I believe we've discussed on here, where you have these sort of trained, these, sort of Navy SEAL like Antifa super soldiers, shipped in by some shadowy globalist organization, seemingly. So again, I think that is what Ari Aster is depicting in that film. There's the enemy that they want to be fighting. They want there to be this confrontation with the globalist power center, which presumably would be represented by this highly organized armed insurgency. And instead what you have are these kind of, carnivalesque sort of countercultural, typical kind of Pacific Northwest lefty manifestations, which, sometimes can be destructive in a standard kind of anarchist playbook way. But I don't know where this is going to go, but I do ultimately read it that way, as kind of this attempt to conjure into being this nemesis that you want to confront, and which will give you the power to, or the ability to expand your power. And, finally, I do think, it's worth returning to the origin of the phrase crossing the Rubicon, which is, when Caesar's army crosses the Rubicon basically into the original territory of the Roman Republic. And, this is essentially a kind of a metaphor that means, that some kind of threshold has been crossed, and there's a point of no return. And so, it is worth noting that, as much as I am partly inclined to reflect this as some kind of weird simulacral reflection of the sort of mimetic polarities of the culture war, there is something fundamentally serious and very, ingrained in our lexicon that I think should give us concern about the idea of sort of deploying troops against our own citizenry, which, I don't, when the Tom Cotton op-ed, there have been many cases in which the National Guard has been deployed and has done so responsibly and reasonably, and has brought order in places where that was needed. So I thought the hysteria around the Tom Cotton op-ed was ridiculous in that regard. But at the same time, I think the kind of sloppiness, the rhetorical sloppiness of this administration, again, suggests something to me other than a desire to restore order, which I think would be the correct use of, the correct form of recourse to this kind of strategy. It seems to me more like a desire to force a kind of final, kind of almost apocalyptic confrontation with this despised enemy. And so I think that there is a kind of danger to that, which, again, I hope is ultimately dissipated into stupid, but ultimately, in the long run, inconsequential kind of culture war insanity. But there is something very serious at stake in all of this too.
Yeah, I mean, is it restoring order, or when, do you have this kind of enormous show of force to restore order when the problem isn't disorder, but a kind of slow degeneration? It's like Trump is responding to the problem he wishes he had, which is, people on the street burning things or whatever, as opposed to sort of carnivalesque protests. And instead you have this kind of what the real situation, which is a kind of hollowed out state that for such a long time has no longer does what it's supposed to do, and outsources all this to administration. All of this, all that the state does is administrate and outsources its actual capacities of doing things to sort of private contractors. And so once the state is kind of hollowed out, all you have left is the military. So Trump is sort of confronting a situation that a lot of countries have, which is that you can't really do very much anymore because you're going to come across all kinds of red tape. Like, you can't do this because these organizations have put it into law or interpreted the law in such a way that you can't really, maneuver there. And if you try, there's a humongous class of people whose job it is literally to go and find the best cases to ensure that, to take it to the courts to ensure that you can't do what you need to do in that area. And it's just, that's what the state becomes. And every time that you want to kind of do something, you can't. And you're blocked at in every direction. And, this has happened because it has suited the left and the right for such a long time, or, the entire political spectrum. The right, because it's ostensibly cheaper. This is a sort of the small state, the compact state, that really should be run like a business as much as possible. And then the left has loved it because they have benefited from creating all of these sort of treatment facilities and taking on gazillions of legal cases and getting government contracts. There's this humongous, as I always talk about, this sort of like social problems class, this enormous stratum of society that is constantly just bidding for funding and contracts to ostensibly do things, but they don't really do anything. But they kind of promise that they will administer, study, and contain the problems of society, and they never actually do that. The most horrific example of that being the memification of that awful murder of the Ukrainian young woman and the story behind her murderer, her killer. Well, are we saying sort of ostensible accused killer? And that he was sort of kicked around so much by a state that really wouldn't do anything with him, and a judge finally that was more interested in putting him into a kind of administrative system, a kind of never-ending, going through these sort of never-ending open doors of all of these treatment facilities and programs and so on. And this just goes on everywhere in prisons and so on. I've actually got a book here called Bad Psychology by Robert Ford, which is quite good at explaining how, all these psychologists and so on just like bid for government contracts to like give psychological treatments in prisons that don't actually work, and then secure people's release or not based on whether or not they've taken these programs, which have zero evidence of efficacy and might actually do a lot of harm. So you have the situation where the state just doesn't do anything. And then what do you do then if you want to get something done? Well, it appears as though Trump is trying to just like, okay, that's it. I'm going to cut across all of this. I'm going to send the military in. And that's the state doing something after such a long time of the state's ability to do something deteriorating. But is it actually doing something, or is it a show of force, a kind of performance art? Just like the left does performance art in its protests, everybody's doing this kind of performance art in front of what is essentially a gridlock created by the administrative state that can't really do anything. And even deploying the military won't work. And also deploying the military won't work because it's sort of like pulling this lever that is meant to be pulled when something else is happening, not a slow deterioration. What's the military going to do about that when the problem is the degradation of society and the state and the ability of the state to do anything? That's more of like a slow burn. It's not like an eruption. It's not like petrol bombs or something like that. So I suppose I'm not sure if I'm echoing what you're saying or contradicting or restating it slightly differently, but I see elements of it in my sort of interpretation of what's going on here.
One of the funniest things that's occurred in the kind of gradual excavation of countless little-known right-wing thinkers since 2015 is the sudden emergence of Nick Land on the Tucker Carlson show. Not an appearance by him, but instead an explanation of his work as a window onto our present situation. So, Geoff, what is the kind of purported relevance of Nick Land in terms of the account of him that's being presented to a mass audience, and then what's your own understanding of his work?
So Nick Land is in the limelight because of an interview on Tucker Carlson's show with a guy named Conrad Flynn, who I'd never heard of before, but seems to be somebody who thinks that various elites, including Hollywood elites and tech industry elites, are involved in some sort of occult, esoteric, religious practice and belief, and specifically are attempting to channel demons. Now, this would lead us down a whole other rabbit hole because there are plenty of other people who think this, but I had not come across Flynn's particular version of it. What's notable here is that he gives pride of place to Nick Land because he argues Land is incredibly influential in Silicon Valley. And basically, he shows Tucker a graph which was designed by Land and some of his collaborators in the 90s that they called a numogram, which is essentially a kind of Kabbalistic numerological chart, although it looks a little bit like some kind of circuit diagram. So it could be mistaken for a kind of technological or technical graph, but it's which I think and this kind of gets to the point, is part of the point. It's both it looks like a technical graph, but it is also a kind of occult numerological depiction of some sort of or an instrument for conjuring some sort of entities from the beyond. And so Flynn's basic argument to Tucker is that Land, for several decades, is a sort of cult philosopher who has argued that the significance of the emergence of artificial intelligence is that it is a kind of channeling of otherworldly, perhaps demonic or spiritual entities. And that many people in Silicon Valley read and are interested in Land. And Flynn concludes, therefore, many of the people in Silicon Valley are themselves attempting to use AI to essentially summon up demons. So And indeed, he has a few pieces of evidence for this, because Elon Musk himself has said at various points that when we build AI, we are summoning the demon. So this is a kind of theme that you've seen. It also ties into recent discussion around tech, sort of Elon Musk's fellow PayPal founder Peter Thiel being very interested in the figure of the Antichrist. And so this kind of spiritual dimension of AI discourse has come to light in various ways recently. So what was interesting about this Tucker episode was that many people who are part of or privy to certain online subcultures were just shocked by the image of Carl. There's an already very memeified image of Tucker holding this pneumogram, which is kind of an iconic image from Nick Land's output, and just looking in his typical puzzled way at it. And so this has become a kind of meme. And I suppose what was notable here was the kind of mainstreaming of this cult sort of underground figure, through his appearance on this mainstream conservative show. So, who is Nick Land? Nick Land, interestingly, starts his career as what might be derisively called by some on the right a postmodern neo-Marxist, we might say. He basically is interested in the work of various French philosophers, most notably Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, who in the 1970s write this pair of books, Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus, that attempt to kind of reformulate the theories of specifically Marx and Freud and put them on a new footing. And for our purposes, what's important is that many people in the 1990s they Deleuze and Guattari introduce various concepts, including the virtual, which they're thinking about really before it becomes a way of talking about technology. They're interested in networks. They're interested in decentralization, in what they call the rhizome, which is a kind of network at which any point can connect to any other point, which they counterpose to what they call the arborescent structure, which is that of a sort of hierarchy, a tree-like hierarchy, where everything branches out from a single trunk. And so they introduce all these concepts, and then in the 90s, many of these sort of academic philosophers, Land among them, start applying them and using them to think about what's going on in the digital sphere. And so that's really where Land kind of first comes into the conversation about technology. But whereas many of the people who take this kind of idea take it in a sort of in the direction of essentially the kind of left-wing anti-globalization movement of the 1990s. And here I'd note the figures of Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, who write the best-selling book Empire, published in 2000, who are really, likewise kind of taking the ideas from Deleuze and Guattari about decentralized networks and the shift of capitalism to this kind of nomadic, decentralized structure, from which they conclude that sort of left-wing revolutionary strategies also have to be decentralized and nomadic. And so all of these ideas end up feeding into things like the Occupy movement with its rejection of hierarchical structures and leadership. And so the point is, a lot of these ideas about, and this idea, I think you heard a lot on the left, this phrase, the disgust becomes a network, in this period. And so a lot of these ideas become part of a certain phase of the left in the 1990s and 2000s. But Land takes it in a very different direction, which is that he ultimately, in his 1990s writing, he's very dismissive of sort of the old left because it's attached to the state, this sort of hierarchical dinosaur that is, no longer relevant. And he's very dismissive of socialism, which he sees as a kind of attempt to constrain the proliferation, the kind of unstoppable proliferation of digital networks. And so he outlines these ideas that later become called accelerationism, which is essentially the idea that, the only important kind of political cause is simply the acceleration of the explosive tendencies of capitalism and the technologies attached to it. And so the point is that he sort of takes these ideas in a direction that becomes really not about overthrowing capitalism, but allowing capitalism to realize itself more fully. and this, I'd say, is where the kind of demonic dimension comes in, because what he's interested in is the idea that human cultures and societies over the course of history have in various ways been built around trying to put the brakes on certain runaway processes and prevent acceleration. That, essentially human societies have functioned as a kind of stabilization system, or to use the cybernetic terminology he preferred, a kind of structures for producing homeostasis, for preventing kind of runaway positive feedback cycles, as he called it. And so what he argues is that, ultimately you can associate this, the kind of taboos and barriers and sort of prohibitive structures of many societies up to and including our own, as ways of trying to prevent these kind of runaway processes. And that you can also associate these runaway processes with some kind of absolute outside that, radically threatens and undermines, what we think of as humanity and the human, the human in some sort of stable sense. And so, what he becomes interested in really
sounds here like he might have in mind the St. Paul's epistle to the Thessalonians, where Paul talks about the catechon, or the one who restrains.
Yes.
And there's this, it's a cryptic passage, but there's this idea that something is restraining the emergence of a kind of, basically the end of times. There's some kind of restraining force that's holding off the apocalypse.
Correct. And so for Land, really the mission at all points is in some ways to kind of remove the brakes from this process. And you can see this in, he's not only influenced by these philosophers, but by science fiction, specifically the works of William Gibson and the films like Blade Runner and Terminator. And, maybe Terminator provides the clearest illustration of this, because for him, it's Skynet, which is this kind of accelerative artificial intelligence that, is the representation or embodiment of this kind of runaway process that you need to align yourself with. And, this essentially means and amounts to the destruction of the human, the destruction of humanity. And, for him, this is something to be embraced, basically. And so, and it is something you can kind of connect to the demonic, or to fears of the demonic. And so, to try to sum up here, what's interesting is that, he leaves academia, seems to have some sort of nervous breakdown, ends up as an expatriate living in China. But then in the early 2010s, he reemerges as a participant in what was then the neo-reactionary blogosphere. And so he becomes connected to people like Curtis Yarvin and various other figures who become influential on sort of the alt-right or the dissident right, or these different strains that emerge in that period. And if you read his writings back then, one thing he's reflecting on is the kind of odd alliance that he is part of, because he describes himself at that point as a techno-commercialist, that, essentially his agenda is about, again, removing the brakes, allowing this kind of technological singularity to realize itself through the operations of capital. But he's allied with these figures who are, basically ethno-nationalists and religious reactionaries, basically sort of integralist, sort of Deus Vult types. And so he's often kind of puzzling over the fact of this. And, what he basically accepts is that they all have the same enemy, which is essentially, which is what Yarvin in his Moldbug era designated as the cathedral, which is basically the sort of globalist progressive power structure, which for Land, the problem with which is that it is holding back. And this does get to a kind of tension, right? Because for him, the problem is that it is dead set against allowing this sort of process of capital to fully realize itself. That for him, the cathedral, the function of it is, again, it's what he calls in his earlier work the human security system. It's to create a kind of stability and homeostasis. Now, I suppose what's kind of interesting is that many of the other reactionaries he's in conversation with sort of think the opposite, right? They think that the function of this cathedral is to kind of dissolve traditional communities, to kind of force these new trendy things like transgender ideology on people and so on. So he's in alliance with people who really, in some respects, seem to think the opposite of him. And so that's kind of an odd thing about this. And so just to conclude, he's writing about this 10 years ago, that like he's in alliance with these people who on some level agree with him that the cathedral, the sort of globalist woke, liberal power structure is the enemy, but at the same time who seem to interpret it in more or less the opposite way as him. And what's interesting to see is when Tucker is confronting him, he's doing so from, I'd say, more the perspective of the kind of religious traditionalist background, with like a little bit of the sort of the sort of ethno-nationalist side of things tinged into it. So he really does represent these two other factions that Land in his kind of radical accelerative support for the disruptive tendencies of capitalism has been radically at odds with. And you can see this but has been in alliance with for all this time. And so you can also see this in this dialogue he did shortly after the discussion of his work on Tucker with Alexander Dugin, the philosopher associated with this sort of neo-Eurasian traditionalism, and often claimed to be a kind of leading ideologue behind Vladimir Putin's sort of national, sort of neo-nationalist or sort of Slavic nationalist ideology. So anyway, I forced Ashley to listen to this interview, or at least maybe she listened to part of it. So I'm curious if she has any responses to the discussion between Land and Dugin.
Yeah. See, now I find the demonology stuff interesting that you were talking. It sounded like people were taking it literally. I thought that the demon was like capital and like the AI technocracy. Isn't that what that is? And then he's not literally talking about Satan. It's like kind of like a philosophical, literary way of talking about human-centered morality. I think in your description. Are there people who think it's literally?
No. I mean, Land claims to be in,
or is he literally summoning demons?
He claims to be in communication with interdimensional lemurs. Now, lemurs here refers to a story by William S. Burroughs, The Ghost Lemurs of Madagascar, but which in turn connects to this idea of a Lemurian primal race that comes out of Madame Blavatsky's, sort of theosophical theories. And finally, the idea that lemur, has its root in a word that in Latin that meant ghost or spirit. And so anyway, the point is, he does sort of actually claim to be literally channeling demons. And he does also, I think, understand capital. I mean, he understands capital as a kind of emanation of some sort of interdimensional demonic force. And so, the reason all societies are so bent on controlling it is because it is fundamentally destructive and disruptive of the human, because it comes from the outside. And so that, this is, I think he takes this quite literally. And, but for him, the demon is ultimately something that, is to be sort of positively embraced as a force that will, push us beyond current stasis and into this techno-capital singularity.
People like Nick Land really annoy me because although I struggle with it myself, they're wonderful, they're great philosophers who take really difficult ideas and communicate them in a clear way. And then there are philosophers who take really bad ideas and hide how bad they are by communicating them in a very unclear way. So you cannot tell whether or not they're being serious. Is he not just saying, I, for one, welcome our robot overlords? Is that not essentially like boil it down? Because there's all these fears as well in the sort of like AI doomer world that the AI is going to and doesn't have any kind of stop built into it to stop it from using us for its own terms. And that seems to be what Land is saying will happen or is happening, that there is some kind of force that is using humanity. Like he kind of flips, instead of saying like humanity or like history is God's plan for man, humanity is just this raw material for this greater non-human intelligence. And this is kind of like the fear that AI doomers have, that there's this, it will use us for its own purposes, kind of like Matrix style of just like self-preservation, i.e. getting as much energy as possible to fuel itself. So is he not just being like, yeah, and it's good? Is he like the guy who's like eating?
I would not dispute that characterization. He's I will say he's a very good writer. So he's, I think somebody who you can kind of learn things about the moments that he's writing in. I'd say particularly, the 1990s, he really, I think, kind of correctly captures things about, there's sort of all this overwhelming optimism about the trajectory of digital technology in that period, really coming from across the political spectrum. And again, there's a kind of fetishization of decentralization and networks and things like that you can find as much on the right as on the left, right? As much on in the establishment as on the fringes. And so what's interesting to me is in his early work, he sort of takes that logic and takes it to a very stark and sort of nightmarish place, so it feels like it's kind of the bad dream or sort of nightmare version of the mainstream positive discourse. And then, in the early 2010s, I think, again, we're at a high point where Silicon Valley is very aligned with like the Obama administration. There's again this kind of idea about digital technology being this, force for good in the world and, a means of achieving all of these progressive ends and so on. So I think, again, he comes in there and provides a very dark spin on the actual meaning of this technology, which I think does, whether you, I think even if you find his evaluation of it quite disturbing and difficult to accept, he does actually capture something that is, being excluded from the sort of mainstream discourse about these developments at both these moments. So for that reason, I do think he's an important figure, but he does also kind of raise all kinds of problems because in some level, I think, the dialogue between him and somebody like Dugin, Dugin has historically had a kind of connection to Steve Bannon. So, to that extent, he represents a certain faction of the Trump coalition. But then, Land is kind of tied to the techno accelerationist side of the Trump coalition. And so what's interesting is, 10 years ago, Land is writing blog posts about, well, I'm in this blogosphere where I'm like weirdly, I just want the techno-capitalist singularity, but I'm in this blogosphere with all these people who want to like preserve traditional society and preserve the nation and things like that. And so what does that mean? And what's interesting is now he's actually, or his ideas have a certain foothold in power. And again, that sort of extremely difficult kind of coalition is attempting to govern in some form, or at least pretending to. And so the question is, what does it mean? Can you have a sort of a governing philosophy that is at once kind of ethno-nationalist, religiously traditionalist, and techno-accelerationist? And, I will say, if you read, people can check out his work that was published in this volume, Xenosystems, from a decade ago. I mean, he does kind of grapple with this question at length. I won't summarize it all, but it's it's quite prescient in the sense that I think he's writing from the perspective of like, wow, I'm in this weird blogosphere space with all these other fringe right-wing people, and we all hate the same stuff, but we seem to think completely opposite things. And in some sense, now that is the kind of contradiction of like the governing coalition of the United States.
Yeah, I just don't think he realizes how much the World Economic Forum and all the wokes that he hates are saying the exact same thing as them, just with a facade of liberalism or a facade of like wanting to stop. I'm not sure that they are. I don't know.
Well,
I don't know.
You and I should talk about this more.
I will say what, yeah.
But no, I was just going to say we should talk about this more on Blame Theory, which listeners should check out, the Blame Theory podcast, because it ties into our recent series on the crisis of liberalism. Because I think, one interesting thing about Land, particularly more recent Land, is he's, attempting to rescue what he calls paleoliberalism, which is essentially, and this is where, in some ways he's a kind of, he's one of, to use Quinn Slobodian's term, Hayek's bastards. I mean, he's a kind of neo-Hayekian, because he wants to rescue this notion of paleoliberalism, which is just sort of unregulated markets, the invisible hand, etc. In his interview with Dugin, or his conversation with Dugin, I believe he cites Goethe. He talks about the invisible hand, but he also cites Goethe's Faust, the passage where Mephistopheles describes himself as a part of that force that always seeks evil, but always causes good. And so again, this is kind of this connection of the demonic, the invisible hand of capital to the demonic. So, and I mean, he makes that explicit in the conversation with Dugin. So he is essentially he's trying to argue that you can isolate a kind of paleoliberalism, as he calls it, from all the bad stuff that comes later. And I think you and I should probably discuss this more in another context. But that's kind of where he fits into the discourse, and I do think he represents something in. I mean, there are various things that are really significant to this administration. He kind of wants to argue you can have a kind of radical free market liberalism, but in one country. Like the Anglosphere can have radical free market liberalism, but then, you can protect that within tariff walls, I guess. And then, Russian society can have another economic order that's more reflective of its sort of ethnocultural disposition. So that sort of seems to be where he and Dugin try to find some sort of common ground. And so then the question is, okay, but can you have a liberalism that isn't about, that isn't fundamentally committed to free trade? In his current iteration, Land sort of seems to be saying this, that you can have kind of liberalism in one country, to paraphrase Stalin.
Yes. It's extremely interesting, and actually brings to a head so many of the kind of contradictions that we've been talking about in that series. So I have to think about this, because there's about 17 different strands I've been trying to follow. And at the moment, I feel like that meme of that guy with like all the threads on the board, and he's like, connecting pictures on a board. That's what I feel like at the moment. And I'll have to sort through what the heck is going on here. So let's talk about this more. Well, but I don't know. It seems to me like this is what happens when you accelerate the economic side without the political.
Yeah. So we'll continue this discussion in Blame Theory. So check that out, everybody. look on your favorite podcast app, Blame Theory Podcast, with me and Ashley, to be discussed. Can you have liberalism in one country? And additionally, I should also add, a couple of years ago, Nick Land published a few things in the pages of Compact, so people can check those out. They're actually somewhat uncharacteristic of his work because they're about the English literary canon, starting with the biblical translation of William Tyndale and going up to the works of Joseph Conrad. So it may be the only place where he has written at length about sort of classic works of English literature. And so that's definitely worth a read. Three essays you can find by Nick Land in the pages of Compact, which I believe at this point are his most recent kind of long form writing. He does tweet, but and they're striking and sort of uncharacteristic in some ways, although also they do tie in fascinating ways to some of the themes I brought up. Other than that, people should check out Fanged Noumena if they're interested in understanding his work. It's a collection published by Urbanomic Press in 2011 of his major writings mostly from the 1990s. So if people want to get a deeper sense of what I was talking about there. And finally, people can also check out the CCRU writings 1997 to 2003, which is a set of collaborative writings he did with his colleagues at the University of Warwick in the late 90s into the early 2000s. And they're extremely strange, and that's where you can find out about the pneumogram that appears in that now iconic image of Tucker looking very befuddled. And it's the pneumogram, the significance of it is explained at length in that volume of CCRU writings, 1997 to 2003.
With that, thanks to Ashley, thank you, Geoff, and thank you, listeners. For more, go to compactmag.com/subscribe.